texted Miss Teen USA and said things about like, oh, because I own it, I get to go into the locker rooms and stuff. And these
Right.
are like teen kids. Yeah.
Right.
Also, Trump's daughter Ivanka started modeling for Casablancas at Elite at like age 15 or so. Also, and the New York Times articles about that are pretty crazy too. They describe her as wearing like white see-through dresses, even though that she has baby fat on her cheeks still. I don't know how this was normal back then. I
It was
think
a
it's
little
pretty
overwhelming.
clear at this point that we have an entrenched oligarchy problem. So if you're talking about electoral politics, maybe you call them the donor class. And the donor class, if you're working with either of the main two parties, corrupts absolutely. And we've seen that time and again. So how much time is really left to continue relying on electoral politics as our only way to fight against this extreme oligarchy that is motivated by putting a boot on our face forever and stealing our money through repeated wealth transfers.
In this explosive segment, Whitney Webb unpacks the real story behind Jeffrey Epstein's rise to power. She explains why Epstein's intelligence ties are almost impossible to prove directly, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Webb details Epstein's early connections to elite networks, his mysterious hiring at Dalton, and the broader context of sex blackmail as a tool of control. She also exposes Leslie Wexner's organized crime ties and the formation of the mega group, revealing how billionaire networks have shaped American business, politics, and the cover-up of Epstein's financial crimes. Essential viewing for anyone seeking to understand the true depth of the Epstein scandal.
Well, it's a good question because one of the other figures who sort of gets ignored in the context of the Epstein case, whose name comes up a lot, is Thomas Pritzker. And there's actually, I think, more than one Pritzker in the Black Book. But Pritzker's been named by victims and seems to come up a lot. And he's part of the family that runs Hyatt hotels. Oh no, they're related. They're related. As
Oh,
I note in the very
Christ.
beginning of volume 1 of my book, the Pritzkers actually have longstanding ties to organized crime and were one of the earliest clients of Castle Bank, which was created by the CIA banker Paul Hellawell and one of the lawyers for the Pritzker family, whose name escapes me at the moment. Sorry about that. Or you work for the
Because
modern mob. I
yeah.
think one of the things that Hollywood has tried to convince people is that the mob disappeared, but really they just rebranded as CEOs and corporate philanthropists. And, I think they're pretty provably still around. Well, Leslie Wexner is a good segue from what I just brought up, because Leslie Wexner, of course, is Jeffrey Epstein's main benefactor. And he has alleged organized crime ties, which are interesting to explore.
And
So in the
he's
mid
Mr.
19
Victoria's Secret.
yes, the
Okay.
Limited,
Just
Limited 2, Abercrombie and Fitch, who I believe the longtime head of that was just arrested or charged with, being predatory towards minors. It seems to be a recurring theme in Wexner world. What do you know?
what do you know?
So in 1985 or so, one of the lawyers for Wexner's business interests in Ohio was shot in the face in broad daylight. And it happened days before that lawyer named Arthur Shapiro was supposed to testify to the IRS. Interesting. So Columbus, Ohio police began investigating that, and one of the analysts there produced a report essentially tying the crime to Leslie Wexner and detailing Leslie Wexner's ties to organized crime, specifically the Genovese crime family in particular in New York. And that was heavily suppressed by the then Columbus police chief, as he and some other figures were paid by Leslie Wexner to serve as private security at his residences and for other interests. And it wasn't really, the document was suppressed for a long time until a Columbus area lawyer and journalist named Bob Fitrakis accidentally obtained it via a FOIA request. And now you can find it on archive.org and read it for yourself. But Leslie Wexner in let me backtrack. So sometime between 1985 and 1987, depending on who you believe, Leslie Wexner hires Jeffrey Epstein to untangle his tangled finances. And Epstein had previously worked at Bear Stearns. He left in 1980, I believe, and he had mainly done rather suspect tax stuff for the elite clients of Bear Stearns. Well, Ace Greenberg ran Bear Stearns at the time, and he thought that Jeffrey Epstein was the best ever, why his kids were attending the Dalton School, and that it was apparently forged through whatever teacher-student relationship, I guess, that Epstein had developed with his children that decision was made. He ends up leaving because of a tie to an insider trading scandal that intimately involves the Bronfman family. And in 1991, Leslie Wexner and the Bronfmans co-create this group of billionaires called the Mega Group, or that's what it's called by the Wall Street Journal, like 7 years after it was created. The first article on this group appears. And that's what they called themselves, but they're also referred to as the study group in that article. And the other members that are named have ties to organized crime also, which is interesting. Like the Crown family of Chicago have historic ties to organized crime. They run General Dynamics, the defense contractor. Among other things. They have a big role at JP Morgan too, which I did a series about a couple years ago about how Jamie Dimon only became the CEO of JP Morgan because of basically Leslie Wexner's other right-hand man besides Epstein, John Kessler, and then the interests of the Crown family. So maybe that's why JP Morgan banked Jeffrey Epstein so extensively, as we know from the USVI case that was settled out of court. And another one of these figures is that's involved with the Mega Group in the early 90s is the Tisch family, and they used to manage resorts for Resorts International, which I mentioned earlier, and specifically Paradise Island, which had a lot of mob connections in particular, like a lot of mob money when Castro came to power, a lot of the mob interests that had been in Cuba under the Batista regime moved to other areas of the Caribbean. And so Paradise Island became one of their hotspots, basically. So the Tisch family operated Paradise Island, but Resorts International owned it. So a lot of those connections are interesting. And then Tisch also had a tie to Michelle Sindona, who comes up in the Flavio Briatore article, because basically Michelle Sindona was this banker in Italy who died in prison, even though he was under 24-hour police watch. He was poisoned with cyanide-laced coffee as part of this big scandal that enveloped Italy that was basically built around this lodge called a Freemason lodge called P2, but it involved all this other stuff. It's kind of a crazy story in and of itself. But he was involved in that. He and P2 were linked to the collapse of numerous banks in Italy and also in the U.S. And the U.S. bank that Sindona had gotten involved with, he illegally bought shares because as an Italian, I don't think he was allowed to own it. And so he bought the shares illegally from Lawrence Tisch, who was this founding member of the Mega Group. And Sindona had all these mob ties. I know it's a lot of info, so basically I will distill it and say that Leslie Wexner has alleged organized crime affiliations and then teamed up with this group of billionaires, some of whom also have Epstein affiliations. But basically this entire group has organized crime ties. And they're all billionaires, and they get together a couple times a year, and they decide how to spend their money. And they have a lot of connections also to the state of Israel. Like this group is known to have spawned, for example, Birthright Israel, which is a youth program, right, where American Jews are sent to Israel and basically given this guided tour that makes it seem really great and sort of whitewashes, well, not sort of, absolutely whitewashes the occupation of Palestine, and tries to prevent Jewish Americans from intermarrying with other groups. At least that's how Michael Steinhardt and some of the creators of it describe it.
Webb reveals how Epstein's financial crimes have been overshadowed by his sex crimes, and why both are crucial to understanding the cover-up. She connects Epstein's story to a long history of elite sex blackmail operations, showing how these networks have shaped politics and business for decades. The discussion exposes the deep connections between billionaires, organized crime, and intelligence agencies, and how these relationships have protected powerful figures from accountability.
He also hosted Miss Teen USA and said things about like, oh, because I own it, I get to go into the locker rooms and stuff.
Right.
And these are like teen kids. Yeah.
Right.
Also, Trump's daughter Ivanka started modeling for Casablancas at Elite at like age 15 or so. Also, and the New York Times articles about that are pretty crazy too. They describe her as wearing like white see-through dresses, even though that she has baby fat on her cheeks still. I don't know how this was normal back then, but I guess. I was just going to say that basically most American malls when I was growing up, and I'm assuming when you were growing up too, consistently, no matter what mall you're going to, a lot of the stores were owned by Wexner. Because he owned, Abercrombie, Limited to the, all of those were him. And the reason he was in every American mall is because one of his business mentors was Alfred Taubman, who later went to prison for fixing auctions at Sotheby's. But basically, he was the owner of not most, but a lot of mall commercial retail space. And so he basically gave Wexner a deal on commercial retail spaces, so he was able to colonize. Hard to know because it depends on what figure you're talking about. I'm sure Jeffrey Epstein's motivations were different than Leslie Wexner's initially when they got into this whole thing. Again, it's really hard to know. Or like Edgar Bronfman Sr., his dad had mob affiliations and built up an empire.
The mob
connections,
mob
right?
Connections. Okay.
So it depends on who you're being connected to. But I mean, I think it's pretty clear that in the United States, there's an unaccountable oligarchy. And the people that end up reaching those echelons of wealth and power, they get there oftentimes with help by people that are already there. New York is more mafiaed out, I think, than most cities, and it has a long-standing power structure that has been immovable for a very, very long time. But I would, obviously I've been dumping on Trump a bit, but that's because, that's kind of he's in power right now, and we're talking about his Epstein ties. But the Democrats have a lot of extensive ties to these networks as well. And really, when you want to talk about how this particular organized crime syndicate entered politics, they took over the Democratic Party of New York first. And they did that by taking over the unions and killing or threatening heads of the unions and then putting mob affiliated figures or mob associates in those positions, and then use that to take control of the Democratic Party in New York. And then, I mean, they later do that with the Republicans too. I mean, like Thomas Dewey, who was a New York Republican who ran against Eisenhower, I believe, he was very affiliated with mob interests. And he had famously been a prosecutor supposedly targeting the mob, and then becomes a business associate of the mob shortly thereafter. The CIA, right? How does the CIA come to exist? So basically the precursor to the CIA it's the OSS, and it's all Wall Street bankers. And some of the most notorious early heads of the CIA, like the Dulles brothers, were Wall Street lawyers. And the early coups of the CIA were all done on behalf of U.S. corporations. Right?
Yeah.
And to protect U.S. corporate interests. So when we talk about intelligence agencies, whether it's in the U.S. or Israel, a lot of times people talk about them as if they're monoliths unto themselves, but they serve people. And usually they serve oligarchy. And I would argue they serve transnational oligarchy. And more often than not, they tend to have ties to this crime syndicate if you go far back enough. So in the fact that the CIA and the OSS developed ties to the mob, it's historical record. Now, the OSS did it as part of Operation Underworld in World War II. It was justified out of wartime necessity. We have to work with the mob because we have a war to win. And then the CIA continued affiliations with the mob. They used them as, head of their assassination squads in Latin America, used them to try and get at Castro in Cuba, among other things. But the CIA is more often than not serving the interests of American oligarchy at the end of the day. So I would argue that. Yeah. Well, also, in Iran too, the overthrow of Mossadegh, it was done on behalf of British and American oil interests. the overthrow of Salvador Allende, Allende was going to nationalize copper. American British mining interests there again. And then, of course, United Fruit Company in Guatemala. And United Fruit Company actually later came into ownership of Max Fisher, and who was Leslie Wexner's business mentor, and has a lot of past affiliations to the CIA beyond the Guatemala coup as well.
To watch the full interview, check out the link in the description. Whitney Webb's research exposes the hidden power structures behind the Epstein scandal. She urges viewers to look beyond the headlines and recognize the systemic corruption at play. Share your thoughts. How deep do you think the cover-up goes? Subscribe for more investigative reporting. SIM swap fraud is sweeping the globe, and your mobile security is at risk. Switch to Ifani and lock out SIM swap fraud and get the most elite mobile protection in the world. Ifani guarantees 100% protection from SIM swaps, backed by a $5 million insurance policy. Stay secure with reliable coverage, free international roaming, and unlimited data. Trust Ifani to keep your communications and assets secure. Get military-grade protection, 24/7 concierge service, and a hassle-free upgrade. Click the link below for $150 off. Thanks for watching. Help support this channel and receive exclusive offers from one of our partners located in the description. We'll see you on the next one.